I once thought missing a dinner wasn't a big deal, until I walked into the room and saw my daughter raising her glass, my son laughing proudly around a table that used to be mine. They lied. They sold my house, without a word, not one word. That night I didn't scream. I let the truth speak louder than the applause and chandelier lights. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now and don't miss the next haunting and unforgettable episodes we bring to you. The morning light filtered through the faded lace curtains, casting soft patterns across the wooden floor of the small Oregon cottage. The walls were lined with books, many worn spines, cracked margins, inked with decades-old notes, but they sat untouched now like loyal companions whose voices had been silenced. The air smelled faintly of old cedar and jasmine tea leaves, which Evelyn Grace kept in a jar labeled with her late husband's handwriting for the rainy days. She didn't need an alarm clock. Her body knew the time like it knew the creaks of the house and the way the wind leaned against the north window before storms. At 75, sleep came lighter dreams, more vivid, and mornings, though quieter, still arrived with routine. Evelyn sat up slowly, one hand bracing her hip, the other reaching for her glasses. She didn't wince, though her joints ached. Pain was no longer an interruption. It was a companion. She placed her slippers on the kind with soft fur lining that Liam, her grandson, had gifted her 2 Christmases ago, back when he still believed that small gestures mattered. She shuffled to the kitchen. The floorboards groaned beneath her with the same protest they always had, like the house remembered every footstep it had ever held. She opened the drawer, took out the kettle, filled it from the faucet, and set it on the stove. The flame clicked, then hissed to life. On the counter sat 2 teacups, one pristine, one cracked slightly near the rim, the one Robert used. She kept setting it out, not because she was senile, but because letting go of certain things felt like betrayal. Even after 12 years, the chair across from her felt temporarily empty, never permanently vacant. While waiting for the kettle to sing, she walked over to the mantel where a photograph stood framed in walnut. Robert Grace in a corduroy jacket, mid-laugh, with a chalkboard behind him reading "All Words Matter." It was taken the day the town voted to name the library hall after him. Evelyn had voted last. She touched the frame gently, then whispered, "It's Tuesday. You'd say it's too early for tea and too late for sleep." The kettle whistled. She poured the hot water over the tea leaves and let it steep, no rush, no noise. The house was still but not silent. The walls remembered. She sat down at the table and opened the folded napkin. A blueberry muffin, store-bought, not her own. Baking felt like too much lately. The last time she baked was for Liam's 18th birthday. He hadn't eaten it then, just said he'd have it later, then forgot it in his car. She stared at the rising steam and let it touch her face. Then the phone rang. She reached for it without urgency. Only 2 kinds of people called the automated pharmacy system or her children when they needed something. "Nathan," she said softly as the caller ID blinked. "Mom," came the voice, upbeat but hurried. "I need your help with something. It's just some paperwork, just a quick signature on a bank form, nothing complicated." She let the silence stretch before answering. "What kind of paperwork, Nathan?" "Oh, just standard banking stuff," he said too quickly. "You remember the mortgage on the lake house? I'm just consolidating some assets, shifting accounts, financial gymnastics, you know." "I don't actually." He chuckled nervously. "Well, it's not a big deal. I can swing by this afternoon, leave it on the porch. You don't even have to come out if you're not feeling up to it. Just sign the last page." There it was. No "how are you," no "how's your hip," no "do you need anything?" Just a signature. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. "I'll be home," she said finally, her voice even. "Great. Love you, Mom," he said, already fading into the busy static of whatever came next in his day. She set the phone down, but not the weight of the call. It hadn't always been this way. Nathan used to bring her daffodils from the field behind the school, used to draw pictures of them together holding books. But time was greedy, and so were other things. She heard the gate click. Liam, the familiar rhythm of his steps, one heavy, one quick, told her it was him even before she saw his tall frame past the window. He didn't knock, just pushed the door open. Grandma, in the kitchen. He appeared, backpack slung over one shoulder, phone in hand, scanning something. "Do you have that copy of The Great Gatsby I lent you, the annotated one? I need it for class." She rose slowly, went to the shelf, and retrieved the well-worn copy. "I think you'll find my margin notes annoying." He smiled absently, took the book, and was already halfway back to the door. "No tea?" she asked. He paused, blinked as if just realizing she'd expected him to stay. "I've got a quiz in 20 minutes, and I promised Audrey I'd meet her at the library to prep." A pause hung between them, neither warm nor cold, just empty. He noticed the muffin on the table. "Still buying from Marvin's grandma. Their muffins are like cardboard. You should bake your own." She smiled faintly. "No time, remember." He didn't catch the sting. He was already at the door. "I'll call later." She didn't wait for the door to shut. Back at the table, she stared at the muffin. Maybe she would feed it to the birds. Maybe she'd throw it out. The tea had gone cold. She stood, walked to the sink, poured it out, then stood there holding the cup like it might explain something. The phone vibrated again. A text from Claire. "Busy with inventory. Can't talk. Next week." Evelyn looked at the message, then placed the phone face down on the counter. "Next week. Next month. Next year." She opened the back door and stepped into the garden. Robert's roses had survived the frost. She touched one bloom blood red and full. "You would have known what to say," she whispered. But Robert wasn't here, and something in her bones told her something was coming. Something big. She just didn't know what yet. The morning air still held the dampness of dawn as Evelyn stepped out into the garden. Her slippers brushed through dew-glazed grass, and the hem of her sweater picked up the moisture from the roses lining the fence. The sky above was a soft blue-gray one, of those hesitant Oregon mornings that couldn't quite decide between sun and mist. A slight breeze tugged gently at her collar as if beckoning her to listen. The garden had once been Robert's domain. He called it his little ministry of chaos. He never planted in straight rows, never labeled anything. His philosophy was simple. Let them surprise you. And they always did. Wild thyme sprouted near the begonias. Strawberries fought for room under the plum tree. Nothing made sense yet. It all flourished. Evelyn had kept it going even if her knees protested, even if the soil didn't take to her the way it had to Robert. She paused at the bird bath, watching a robin peck at the rim. A rustle from behind the fence caught her ear, and a familiar voice floated over. "Morning, Evelyn. You're out early." It was Marian Fletcher, her next-door neighbor, a woman 2 years her junior, but with twice the energy and none of the tact. Evelyn managed a polite smile. "Good morning, Marian. You're always up before the birds?" "Well, someone's got to keep an eye on the neighborhood before the squirrels take over." Marian chuckled and walked closer to the fence, a folded envelope in her hand and a sense of news practically spilling from her eyes. "I saw the decorations going up at the school yesterday. Must be pulling out all the stops for the gala." Evelyn blinked. "Gala? You haven't heard?" Marian raised a brow. "Oh, it's going to be lovely, the 60th anniversary of Oak Ridge High. I read in the paper they're doing a full formal dinner awards, old faculty returning, all that jazz. Claire's organizing the floral arrangements, I think." Evelyn's heartbeat slowed, then spiked like her chest had suddenly realized it forgot how to breathe. "No," she said, voice low. "No one mentioned it." Marian seemed confused for a moment, then backpedaled with the grace of someone who'd already realized they'd stepped in something foul. "Oh, well, maybe it slipped Claire's mind. Or Nathan's. Or maybe they're planning to surprise you." Evelyn didn't answer. Her hands drifted toward the rose bush behind her fingers, brushing a thorn. She barely noticed the sting. "Anyway," Marian added quickly, "I'm sure they'll say something soon. 60 years, it's quite the milestone, especially for someone like you. Robert, too. If he were alive, they'd be putting him on a pedestal." She tried to smile again, and this time it cracked halfway up her cheek. Evelyn waited until Marian disappeared into her house before turning back to her own. Inside, she walked straight past the tea set she'd left on the table, the now cold muffin, the soft clink of a wind chime by the window. She climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, where the light was dimmer and the smell of cedar deeper. At the end of the hall was a room no one had entered in months. She opened the door, the hinges whining in quiet protest. It was Robert's old study. A room of books and artifacts, globes, typewriters, notes yellowed with time. She hadn't touched it since he passed. She wasn't ready. She still wasn't. But now something else stirred inside her, a faint, rising tremor of doubt. Not grief, not yet anger, just displacement. Disbelief raw and formless. The Gala, 60 years. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled down a thick, leather-bound album. Dust trailed behind her fingers. She opened to a page near the middle. A photograph. Robert, 32 years old, standing under the freshly painted sign, Oak Ridge Literary Society, grand opening. His beard was unkempt, his hair windblown, his smile wide like he'd just done something daring. Beside him stood Evelyn, 30, in a wool skirt and cardigan, clasping a stack of books to her chest. They looked so alive. That day they had no funding, no permission, no official blessing from the school board. Just a room, borrowed desks, and 15 students who wanted to stay after hours and read beyond their curriculum. Evelyn remembered the feeling in her stomach, the kind of thrill usually reserved for falling in love or breaking the law. They'd stayed late every Friday night. They read Shakespeare by candlelight, Poe by flashlight, passed around torn copies of Maya Angelou and Steinbeck and Baldwin. They'd started book drives, literacy fundraisers, late-night potlucks. She turned the page. Robert with his arm around a student who'd just won the statewide essay competition. Evelyn handing out certificates at the first community writing contest. A check with her signature for the first set of used books they'd purchased from a closing bookstore downtown. She ran her hand down the photograph, the edge of her nail catching on the corner. That was the year they both stopped trying to fit into what teaching was supposed to be. They didn't just teach literature, they taught kids how to find themselves in stories, how to feel seen, how to fight softly and surely for their place in the world. She had written grants by candlelight. Robert had painted murals by hand on the school walls when the budget wouldn't allow for decoration. And now, 60 years later, they were throwing a gala in that very school, a celebration. And she hadn't even received a call. Not an invitation, not a mention. Just an offhand remark from a neighbor. She stood motionless, surrounded by shadows that didn't belong to the present. It was a feeling she couldn't quite name, something between being forgotten and being erased. Had they truly left her out? Had her own daughter Claire, who once begged her to read Wuthering Heights twice in one summer, forgotten her role in all of this? Had Nathan, who helped paint the banners for the library's first readathon, decided she was no longer relevant enough? Was she unnecessary now? A relic, a name in a yearbook, a chair without a place at the table. She closed the album. Her hands trembled just slightly, but her eyes were sharp. Back downstairs, the house didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt silenced. Deliberately, she walked to the kitchen, stood by the window, and watched as the town slowly awakened. Children in backpacks waited at corners. A woman walked a dog. A school bus hissed at the bend of the road. She remembered how Robert used to say, "Our legacy isn't a name carved in marble. It's a bookmark left in someone's life." She had bookmarks everywhere in students who'd grown up to be writers, and letters from alumni still thanking her for showing me I mattered. But none of them would be at the gala. Not without her. She took a breath and opened her phone. Scrolled. No messages. No missed calls. Nothing from Claire. Nothing from Nathan. She opened the calendar app. 60 years to the day. And not even a text. She closed the phone, placed it face down, and stared at her reflection in the window. That faint, dull ache of disquiet began to take shape now, growing sharper, colder. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was exclusion. And it wasn't just about a party. It was about recognition, about dignity. And Evelyn Grace, former co-founder of the Oak Ridge Literary Society, widow of Robert Grace, and silent steward of countless young minds, was not going to be written out quietly. It was just after noon when Evelyn opened the front door and nearly stepped on the envelope. At first she thought it was another real estate flyer, the kind that seemed to multiply in recent months, each promising fast closings and generous cash offers for legacy homes. They always called it that. Legacy. As if stripping a memory from its foundation made it sound noble. She bent slowly, her joints protesting more from the heaviness of her thoughts than the movement itself. The envelope was thick, off-white, embossed return address in the corner. J. Langford and Associates, Attorneys at Law, not addressed to her. Claire Bennett was written in clean-typed font across the front. She stood there for a moment, the envelope in her hand, the world narrowing to just that one detail, her daughter's name. sent to this house. Claire hadn't lived here in nearly 3 decades. Not since the week she got married and swore in a teary farewell that she would come back every Sunday. The Sundays had become Christmases, then occasional phone calls, then mostly silence, and yet here was a legal envelope meant for Claire, delivered here, as if the house still belonged to her in some unseen way. Evelyn walked inside slowly, the envelope held like it might burn her. She sat at the dining table beside the untouched tea from hours ago. The house was silent again, too silent, like it was holding its breath. Her fingers slipped under the flap. She hesitated. A small part of her, trained by decades of politeness, of being the careful mother, the patient teacher, whispered, "It's not yours, don't open it." But something deeper, older, roared back, "This is your house. Your name is on the deed, not hers." The glue gave way. The pages slid out neatly, 3, maybe 4 sheets, and a small yellow receipt attached with a paperclip. She scanned the letter. Her eyes jumped past the headers, past the legal language, until they froze on one phrase circled in black ink. Receipt of initial deposit for pending sale of property located at 41 Ashwood Lane. Her address, her home. Below, Claire's name was printed under the line for seller. Her signature, too. Evelyn's throat constricted. Her hands trembled, not with age, but with something sharper, colder. She turned to the last page. A projected closing date 2 weeks from today. She stared at it as if the paper itself might disappear. Her fingers clutched the receipt, reading and rereading it, trying to find some loophole, some mistake. But the facts stared back, merciless. They were selling the house. Claire was selling it. No mention, no conversation, no request, only signatures. And Claire's was not the only one on the form. There was another, Evelyn Grace, signed in smooth, confident pen. But it wasn't hers. She felt the blood rush to her ears. Her vision narrowed for a moment, and she gripped the edge of the table until her breath returned. She stood too fast. The chair scraped across the floor with a screech. She moved toward the back hallway, her feet suddenly fast determined. She opened the closet door near the stairs, pulled out the worn metal box she hadn't touched in nearly a year. The place where she kept the deed insurance, Robert's will. All the documents that mattered. The ones Claire had no business touching. Her fingers worked quickly now. The latch popped. She yanked open the box and pulled out the manila folder. Something felt wrong before she even looked inside. It wasn't the weight, though it was lighter. It wasn't the sound, though some of the crisp rustle was missing. It was the shape. Too thin. She opened it. The deed was gone. So was the notarized affidavit Robert had left, stating the house would never be sold without mutual agreement if she passed before him. Evelyn had insisted on it after a health scare 15 years ago. Robert agreed, saying, "You can't trust sentiment alone to protect memory. Put it on paper." It was gone, too. Only a handful of less essential forms remained. Insurance, water rights, some bank correspondence from years ago. The air in the hallway felt heavier now, thick as syrup. The walls seemed to press in old wood and plaster, remembering everything they'd held and what they were about to lose. She backed away from the box slowly, like it might explode. Then her eyes caught something on the lower shelf. An ink pad, not hers. She picked it up, opened the lid. Black, clean, new. Next to it, a small pack of sticky notes. On top, a faint imprint of her signature. Her breath caught in her throat. Someone had been here. Someone had taken from here. The house had been quiet, but not empty. She dropped the ink pad like it stung her. Her mind reeled. Claire had a key. Nathan, too. Liam, even. They all did. But who? When? Why? The questions buzzed like hornets in her chest. She leaned back against the wall, heart pounding, not from fear, but fury. This wasn't just theft. It was betrayal. Deliberate, methodical, planned. And for what? For money. For convenience. For the ease of shoving her into some home with peeling linoleum and a name tag on her door. She looked around the hallway like seeing it for the first time. The small clock Robert had carved when they were newlyweds. The faded umbrella stand from her mother's house. The wallpaper Claire had picked out at 17, still peeling, still soft green with tiny white vines. She clutched the empty folder to her chest and moved back to the dining room. The house felt colder now, angrier. She sat at the table again and placed everything in front of her. The envelope, the forged documents, the missing pages. She stared at the signature beside Claire's. Her name, but not her hand. not her will, a lie written in ink. The afternoon light had shifted. The shadows in the room stretched longer now, darker, like everything had taken a step back to watch. Evelyn looked down at her hands. They were shaking again, but not from fragility, from clarity. The kind of clarity that cut through fog, through comfort, through all the things people told her she wasn't allowed to feel anymore. Anger, disbelief, resolve. They thought she wouldn't notice. They thought she wouldn't question it. They thought because she made tea and wore slippers and talked to framed photographs that she wouldn't fight back. But Evelyn Grace had built that house with more than bricks. She had poured memories into its walls, folded books into its shelves, grown roots deeper than any foundation, and now her daughter had forged a pen to uproot it. No, not like this. She stood again, steadier now, moved to the hallway, opened the coat closet, reached for the fireproof safe tucked into the back behind old umbrellas and Robert's gardening apron. She turned the dial. Inside, still intact, was the one document Claire hadn't known about. The original notarized will from Robert, not the copy. The real one, signed, sealed, witnessed. She took it out, careful but swift. A moment later, she retrieved the small, leather-bound notebook Robert had kept a ledger of house repairs, family birthdays, and appointments. Tucked inside were notes Evelyn had made over the years, names of contacts, her lawyer, her accountant, even Mr. Quinlan, the principal of the school who still owed her a favor or two. She sat back down, and for the next 3 hours she didn't cry. She planned. The next morning the rain had already begun before Evelyn stepped outside. Not the angry kind of rain, not a storm, just that fine, persistent drizzle that Oregon did so well. It blanketed everything in a sheen of gray, blurring the lines between tree branches, rooftops, and memory. She didn't bother with an umbrella. She let it settle on her hair and coat like an offering, like proof that the world was still capable of touching her. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, envelope clutched in her coat pocket, then walked to the curb where the taxi waited. The driver gave a polite nod, adjusted the heat, and didn't ask questions. She appreciated that. She wasn't sure she had answers anyway. The ride to Mr. Jenkins' office took 22 minutes. Not that she counted, her fingers did. They pressed lightly against each other, a ritual she'd developed over decades of faculty meetings and doctor visits and funeral speeches. 1, 2, 3, 4, thumb to pinky, start again. The last time she'd been to that office, Robert had still been alive. His cane had clicked on the tiles. His laugh had filled the elevator. That visit had been about legacy, his words. About making sure everything they'd built wouldn't be swallowed by confusion or paperwork. Evelyn remembered how Jenkins had smiled at them both, folded the papers with care, and said, "You two are rare." Today she walked into the same building, same elevator, same hall without him. The office hadn't changed much. Still smelled like old leather and lemon polish. Still had the same receptionist with the soft voice and pitying eyes. "Mrs. Grace," the woman said gently, "he'll see you right away." The door clicked shut behind her as she stepped inside. Thomas Jenkins rose from behind his desk, older now, but still wearing those thick rectangular glasses that made him look slightly startled at all times. He walked around the desk to shake her hand. "Evelyn," he said, voice laced with concern. "It's been a long time." "Too long," she replied, her smile brief and tight. He gestured to the leather chair. She sat. Only then did she pull the envelope from her coat. "I received this yesterday," she said. "By accident, I think. It was meant for Claire." He took it carefully, eyebrows drawing close. "Langford and Associates," he muttered. "Let me take a look." As he unfolded the documents, Evelyn studied his face, not the paper. Watched how his jaw set, how his breath changed when he reached the second page. When he finally looked up, his voice had dropped in pitch. "Evelyn, did you sign these papers?" "No," she answered simply. "You're sure?" She met his eyes. "I would remember signing away my home, Tom." He nodded grimly, turned the page around and pointed. "That's not your signature. Not your ink style, not your cadence. But your name is here. It's a clean forgery." Evelyn didn't flinch. She only stared at her name on the page, warped and foreign. He continued, pulling another sheet from a drawer. "What worries me more is that the sale has already been initiated. Langford's office submitted the documents to the county registrar last Thursday." She blinked. So it's done. No, he said quickly. It's in motion, but it can still be stopped, especially if we can prove that your signature was forged. I'll need a handwriting sample, maybe multiple. I'll file for an injunction to halt the process. That'll buy us some time. Evelyn sat back. The room felt heavier. She looked around bookshelves, awards photographs of Jenkins with mayors and judges, all things that meant something to someone, all things that probably didn't belong to the people in the photos anymore. She thought about her house, about the scuffed floor by the door, the loose knob on the hall closet, the soft hum of the radiator in winter, all things that didn't matter to a buyer, all things that mattered deeply to her. Jenkins leaned forward. Do you want me to pursue this? Her response was immediate. Yes. Do you want to press charges? She hesitated. The question hit harder than she expected. It wasn't about law. It was about betrayal. I don't know yet, she said finally. He didn't push, just nodded and slid the papers back into the envelope. We'll take it one step at a time. She stood, so did he. He looked at her for a long second. You know, if Robert were here. He's not, she said too quickly. Then softer, he's not. Outside, the rain had thickened to a soft curtain falling straight down. Evelyn walked past the rows of parked cars, the courthouse steps slick with water, the bronze plaque by the door catching drops like tears. She didn't open her umbrella, didn't look for a cab. She walked. Each step on the wet pavement echoed louder than it should have. The wind wasn't strong, but it found its way under her collar, across her wrists, down her spine. She welcomed it. Let it pull at her, strip her of anything she hadn't already lost. The streets blurred, her breath made small ghosts in the air. The buildings looked unfamiliar, like they'd grown older without her, like she had stepped out of time and returned to a version of her town where she no longer belonged. And maybe that was true. She crossed in front of a bookstore closed for renovations, a florist gone entirely, a cafe she and Robert used to visit every Thursday now, a vape shop with blacked-out windows. Everything moved forward, even betrayal, especially betrayal. By the time she reached the corner of the park, her hair was soaked. She stopped beneath an old elm leaves trembling above her. The voice in her head was quiet, but present. They don't want me there. She looked up at the canopy of leaves, then out at the fog-shrouded hills beyond. They don't want my stories, my memories, my presence. Her hands balled into fists. She hadn't raised them to be this way, hadn't taught them to sign papers behind backs, to erase their mother from the equation like a stubborn pencil mark. She had given them everything, time, security, the comfort of never having to ask. And they'd taken that gift and turned it into leverage. The raindrops felt colder now. She closed her eyes. They don't want me. She exhaled, a whisper, a verdict. No, she said. Then clearer. No, they don't want me there. A pause. Then the knife of it spoken aloud, voice sharp in the wet quiet. They want the house. She didn't sob, didn't collapse. She stood still under that tree, her jaw set, breath even. Because now she knew. And once a truth like that took root, it didn't unlearn itself. It began not with thunder, but with paper. The house was silent, except for the soft shuffle of documents being laid out in a fan across the kitchen table. Evelyn moved slowly, deliberately. Her fingers no longer trembled, not because the weight of betrayal had lessened, but because she had found a stillness in it. Betrayal no longer surprised her. It only clarified what was necessary. Outside, the rain had stopped. The windows glistened as if someone had traced each pane with a brush of silver. The house, too, seemed to hold its breath, aware that something was shifting inside its walls. She took out the old fireproof safe once again. The edges of the Robert Grace scholarship proposal had yellowed slightly, but it was intact, written years ago after Robert's death during one of her sleepless nights. She had tucked it away like a prayer. For someday. Today was that day. She clipped it to the new set of documents, a revised will, a formal property transfer contract, and a sealed letter addressed to the school board. Everything bore her name, her real signature, her full intent, not as Evelyn Grace, the mother, not as the widow, not as a woman someone tried to erase, but as Evelyn Grace, protector of memory, bearer of story. She placed the documents into a new envelope and pressed it closed with the flat of her palm. The new will was brief, elegant, and pointed. Upon the sale of the house at 41, Ashwood Lane, all proceeds would go to the Robert Grace Literary Scholarship Fund, its primary mission to fund the building of a new wing at Oak Ridge High School, a reading sanctuary named The Room with No Bells, a reference to Robert's favorite line from Auden. The legal power of attorney had also been rewritten, this time not to Claire or Nathan, but to Mr. Jenkins, who had promised to guard the documents personally. There would be no courtroom battle, no public accusations. Evelyn didn't want to punish them. She wanted to render them irrelevant to what mattered most. And that was enough. She took a sip of tea, now lukewarm, and looked at the house one last time as just a house. No longer a battlefield, not yet a legacy, just a home in transition. That evening she drove herself, not a taxi, to the bank. The young clerk behind the counter had a ring through his brow and called her ma'am too many times, but he was kind, efficient. He helped her set up the Robert Grace Fund account with minimal questions. She handed over the property documents, the authorization form, and the wire instructions. He blinked at the numbers. "Are you sure you want the entire deposit sent to the fund, ma'am?" "I'm not taking it with me," she said simply. He nodded. "It's rare, what you're doing." She smiled, a small tilt of her lips. It shouldn't be. By the time she returned home, the sky had turned to lavender and coal, that specific hue of dusk that only happened in Oregon when the clouds thinned just enough to let a hint of sunlight bleed through. She climbed the stairs slowly, not out of fatigue but reverence. Her closet still smelled like cedar and lavender, like the late 80s and early September mornings, like the old life, like him. She reached into the back, past the sweaters, past the coats, and pulled out the navy blue dress. It was wrapped in dry cleaning plastic, untouched for decades. She laid it across the bed, peeled the plastic away. Time had not dulled the fabric's grace. The color still held a dark ocean hue with threads of silver at the waist. Robert had chosen it. He said it matched the way she looked when she read aloud, said it reminded him of the sky right before a storm. She remembered the first time she wore it, the 20th anniversary of Oak Ridge High. Robert had spoken. She had introduced the scholarship fund idea. They'd stood side by side, their hands just brushing behind the podium, invisible to the crowd. That had been the night they danced in the teacher's lounge after everyone left. She undressed slowly and slipped it on. The zipper was stiff at first, but it held. In the mirror, she stood taller than she had in years. Not because she wanted to be seen, but because she refused to disappear. She pinned back her hair, no makeup, just eyes sharp as glass, full of memory. She reached for the drawer by the bed and pulled out a pair of earrings, silver studs shaped like small leaves. A gift from a student years ago. Then she sat on the edge of the bed. Her breath slowed. The house around her breathed too, no longer sad. Just waiting. Downstairs, the documents lay ready. On the table, in order, in defiance. The phone on the counter buzzed a text from Nathan, no doubt asking why she hadn't returned his last call. She didn't answer. She walked to the hallway, paused by the large photograph of the first Oak Ridge graduating class Robert had ever taught. Her fingers brushed the glass, names and faces blurred, but the feeling didn't. She smiled. Voiceover. If I am a chair, then at the very least let me choose where I sit one last time. Silence has a weight to it, especially in a room designed for applause. The gala had frozen in place like a paused scene in a film. Champagne flutes were mid-air. Smiles had calcified. And in the middle of the room, Evelyn stood with the posture of someone who had carried the weight of a family and was at long last setting it down. The folder in her hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of what it contained. "These," she began, lifting the documents with both hands, her voice steady, "are the verified legal records of the sale of my home." Murmurs erupted. A few people exchanged glances. Some turned to Nathan, others to Claire. Most were unsure what they were witnessing. Was this a planned moment, a speech, a scene? Evelyn continued, voice gaining heat. "My signature appears on these forms, but I never signed them. The documents are forged and submitted through an attorney neither I hired nor knew." Claire stepped forward. "Mom, this isn't the time." Evelyn turned sharply, her eyes blazing. "The time was when you decided to sell the house your father died in without asking the woman who still lives there." A hush fell again, and then through that heavy air a voice called from the back of the room. "Let her speak." It was Louis Quinlan, the new principal of Oak Ridge High. A tall man with a graying beard and soft eyes, dressed in a modest suit. He stepped through the crowd, his presence parting them like wind through tall grass. "Evelyn," he said gently, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You built this school. If you have something to say, say it." She nodded, the slightest tremble in her chin. "Thank you, Louis." Then she faced the room again, raising the forged deed in her hand. "My children thought I wouldn't notice, that I was too old, too distracted, too irrelevant." She scanned the faces. Some looked away. Others leaned forward, riveted. Nathan tried to insert himself again, laughing a little too loud. "Come on, Mom. This is clearly a mix-up. We all make mistakes. You probably signed something months ago and forgot." Evelyn didn't raise her voice, but the words hit like glass shattering on tile. "I didn't forget," she said, holding his gaze. "But you forgot. You forgot that I am still lucid, still watching, still your mother, and most of all, still capable of knowing what dignity looks like." Nathan opened his mouth again, but Louis raised a quiet hand. "Let her finish," he said. Evelyn breathed in slowly. This house was not just wood and plaster. It was every story Robert and I ever told, every poem read in whispers on the porch, every scraped knee patched with a lullaby, every candle we lit during blackouts, every laugh we tried to keep going when the world around us was falling apart. The room softened. She held up the second document. "This," she said with quiet force, "is the legal transfer of that home, signed by me, authorized by me, to the Robert Grace Scholarship Fund." A few gasps now, genuine. "I will not fight for bricks," she said, "but I will fight for what they meant." Claire stepped forward now, less confident, more wounded. "Mom, why didn't you tell us you were going to do this?" Evelyn looked at her for a moment, as though she were 10 again, standing in the kitchen with grass-stained knees and a mouthful of excuses. "Tell you," Evelyn echoed. "You sold my home behind my back, and you ask why I didn't tell you." Claire's face fell. There was no good answer. Nathan stepped forward again, trying to regain control. "It was never meant to hurt you," he said. "We thought we were helping." Evelyn's gaze hardened. "No, you were helping yourselves, because it's easier to reframe betrayal as duty than to admit it's theft." Louis stepped closer beside her, now standing shoulder to shoulder. "You forged her name," he said, addressing the room. "You filed documents without consent. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a crime." A ripple moved through the room. Nathan's smile faded. Claire lowered her eyes. Evelyn turned slightly, addressing the board members seated in the front row. The people who had once voted for Robert's tenure, who had sent thank-you notes when she ran after-school programs for underperforming students. "You toasted to legacy tonight," she said. "But legacy isn't a plaque on a wall. It's the choice you make when no one's watching." Her hand shook as she folded the papers back into the envelope. "I chose not to call the police," she said quietly. "Not to sue, not to ruin reputations, because that's not what Robert would have wanted. But I will choose to rewrite the ending." She placed the envelope on the podium. Louis picked it up gently, like it contained something sacred. Evelyn turned to leave. Claire reached for her arm. "Wait," she said, eyes brimming. "Please." Evelyn stopped but did not turn. "What do you want, Claire?" she asked softly. "To say sorry, or to make sure I don't tell the press?" Claire said nothing. "Then we're done here," Evelyn whispered and walked past her. The path opened before her, people too stunned to stop her, too moved to forget her. One teacher placed a hand over her heart as Evelyn passed. Another wiped a tear. Near the entrance, the young volunteer who hadn't recognized her at the door now stood straighter. "Ms. Grace," he murmured. She nodded at him. "Keep reading," she said. "Whatever they tell you to study, read more." And she stepped outside. The air was crisp, cool, free. She exhaled, then disappeared into the night. The door of the Gala closed behind Evelyn with a quiet thud muffled by the fall air. She didn't look back. Inside, the applause never came. There had been no verdict, no judge, no jury, just the unbearable stillness of truth. Back in the hall, Claire stood frozen near the stage, still clutching the corner of her blouse, like it might shield her from what had just happened. Nathan, by now pale and breathless, had retreated to the back of the room, pretending to check his phone, though his hands were trembling. Around them, guests murmured, some in confusion, others in shame. No one clapped, no one toasted, and no one dared to meet their eyes. The projector still glowed on the wall, celebrating 60 years of educational legacy. But the word legacy now hung like smoke, hollow, burned through. Near the board's table, Mr. Jenkins, who had arrived in silence just moments before Evelyn's announcement, now stepped forward. He collected the envelope she'd left behind and tucked it into his coat with care. The message was clear. The matter had shifted from private grief to legal reckoning. In the parking lot, Evelyn sat behind the wheel of her car, breathing steadily. The streetlight above her cast soft circles on the windshield, but her reflection didn't blink. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just existed perfectly still, like someone holding the final page of a book in her lap, unwilling to close it just yet. Her phone buzzed. It was Liam. She didn't answer right away. Let it ring out once, then again. On the third ring, she picked up. Grandma. His voice was careful, quiet, like someone who didn't know where the cracks were but didn't want to step in the wrong place. "Hello, Liam. I just saw the video," he said. "Someone posted it already. It's going everywhere." Evelyn closed her eyes. "So they'll know the truth." "I already knew it," he whispered. That stopped her. Liam exhaled. "I knew they were doing something. Dad had documents on the kitchen table one night, and I saw your name. But I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I had a right to ask." "You always have the right to ask," she said softly, "even when it's inconvenient." There was silence for a beat. Then Liam said, "Can I see you?" "I'm still in the parking lot," she said. "I'll be there in 5. She waited. The street lamp flickered once overhead. She watched her hands resting on her lap, not wrinkled, just lived in, like pages that had been dog-eared too many times. 5 minutes later, a beat-up red car pulled into the lot. Liam stepped out. He didn't look like the boy who once crawled into her lap to read Charlotte's Web. He was taller now, broader, the baby fat gone. But the eyes, those were Robert's, sharp, searching. He walked over without speaking. Then quietly he opened her car door. She stepped out, and they just stood there for a moment in the chill air. No tears, no speeches, just the weight of 100 unspoken things between them. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Evelyn shook her head. "You didn't do it, but I didn't stop it." She looked up at him. "You're not meant to carry the sins of your parents, but you are allowed to learn from them." He nodded. Then, as if pulled by some invisible thread, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something," he said. "It's for you. It's not perfect, but I wanted to say it, somehow." She unfolded the page. It was a poem, "The Chair That Wasn't There." "They built a table for legacy, carved your name but not your place. They toasted stories they never heard and left you in the hallway of grace. But a chair is not a seat. It is the memory of who sat. And tonight the empty space spoke louder than 100 clinks of glass." Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came. Her hand reached out and Liam took it. "I want to help with the scholarship," he said. "For real. I want to be part of what matters." "You already are," she said. Behind them, the last of the Gala guests slipped out, murmuring, confused, some ashamed, some still defensive. But the verdict had been delivered not with gavels, but with silence. And with that silence, Evelyn and Liam walked away from the hall, toward something more honest, toward something earned, toward home, not the house, but the meaning behind it. The road that led to Seaforth Cove was narrow and curved like a signature, winding through dense groves of pine and sudden glimpses of the ocean. Evelyn's car rattled slightly as it hit a patch of gravel near the edge of town. She slowed, rolled the window down, and let the salt air flood in. It smelled like freedom, like rain-soaked books, like Robert's old cardigan on a cold porch. The coastal village was small, just a speck of faded paint, and quiet porches nestled between the cliffs and the water. There were no traffic lights, no glowing billboards, just a bakery with hand-lettered signage, a grocer that doubled as the post office, and just off the main square, a modest whitewashed building with a sea-blue sign that read, Seaforth Community Library. Evelyn parked under a crooked eucalyptus tree. The sun was setting behind her, casting long shadows across the sand and peeling rooftops. She stood outside the car for a moment, suitcase in hand, and looked toward the library. It was smaller than she expected, but somehow it felt exactly right. Inside, the air smelled of dust and salt. A faded carpet lined the floor, and the bookshelves were hand-built, likely by volunteers. An old brass bell jingled as she stepped through the door, and from behind a desk stacked with paperbacks and paper cranes, a young woman looked up. "You must be Evelyn Grace," she said. Evelyn raised a brow. "That obvious." The woman laughed. "Small town. Word travels faster than the tide." Her name was Mara, the town's librarian, an unofficial mayor, teacher, and nurse. She greeted Evelyn not like a guest, but like someone returning from a long trip. "We cleared the upstairs room for you," she said. "It's nothing grand, but the window faces the sea." "I figured that matters." Evelyn smiled. "It does." She climbed the narrow staircase, her fingers grazing the rail. The room was humble single bed, a desk and a window that opened to the sound of waves folding over themselves. She sat down slowly, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, she didn't feel watched. She felt chosen. The next morning, Evelyn opened the front door just before 9 a.m. to find 3 children waiting on the library steps. One had a book clutched so tightly to his chest that the spine had started to curl. Another wore rain boots even though the sky was blue. The third, a quiet girl with hair like ink, just stared at Evelyn wide-eyed. "You're the lady who taught 1,000,000 kids?" the boy in boots asked. "Only 500,000, Evelyn said. "The others taught me." He grinned. She unlocked the doors. That afternoon she sat with the children on a faded rug beneath a sun-streaked window, reading aloud from the secret garden. Her voice, once buried beneath court papers and cold dinners, now floated in the air again, alive, warm, and deliberate. She didn't realize she was smiling until one of the kids leaned into her side. 2 days later, Liam arrived. He walked into the library at noon, holding a brown paper bag and a potted plant. Behind him, a tall, red-haired woman followed nervously, brushing sand off her jeans. "Hope we're not intruding," Liam said. Evelyn looked up from the circulation desk. "You're not," she said, "unless that plant is plastic." "It's basil," Audrey said, holding it out. "We brought lunch." They sat at the small back patio feet, propped on mismatched chairs, wind rustling the ivy along the fence. Liam had picked up sandwiches from a nearby shack and insisted they eat like locals, no plates, just wax paper and lemonade in jelly jars. Audrey, shy at first, began to open up. She was studying social work, driven by a story Evelyn didn't yet know, but she didn't posture, didn't perform. She listened more than she spoke, and when she looked at Evelyn, it was with no judgment, just curiosity. "You seem different here," Liam said quietly, picking at his sandwich crust. "I am," Evelyn replied. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was rich. "I think this town is lucky," Audrey said. Evelyn shook her head. "No, I'm lucky it still had a chair left for me." Liam looked down, ashamed again, but she touched his hand gently. "You showed up, Liam. That's what matters. The rest is just wind." He nodded, his eyes wet but not spilling over. Then Audrey, eyes lighting up, said, "You should start a program, like a reading hour. You'd be amazing." Evelyn's eyebrow rose. "You just met me." "Exactly," Audrey said. "No time for you to say no." The idea took root like ivy. By the end of the week, Evelyn had posted a handwritten flyer on the corkboard outside the grocer's. "Read with Miss Evelyn. Saturdays at 10 a.m. Stories, hot cocoa, and the best seat in the house. Bring your ears, your imagination, and no homework." On the first Saturday, 9 kids showed up. On the second, 16. By the third week, parents were waiting outside with lawn chairs and coffee mugs, listening through the windows, while Evelyn acted out dialogue between pirates and princesses, scientists, and stray cats. Liam and Audrey helped set up chairs and hand out cocoa. Mara donated a set of new beanbags from the town's rainy day fund. One elderly man brought a box of used books and said, "Thought these might like being read again." And Evelyn, she never raised her voice, never reminded anyone who she used to be. She simply was. One evening, after a particularly chaotic reading of James and the Giant, Peach, Evelyn, and Liam sat watching the tide roll in the last light of day burning over the sea. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The house, the history." Evelyn thought for a long time, then said, "History doesn't live in walls. It lives in what you do with what broke you." Liam looked out at the waves. "You think they regret it?" "Claire and Nathan." He nodded. "I think they regret the silence," Evelyn said, "but not enough to speak." And that was the first time she said it without bitterness, just truth. Liam placed a folded envelope on the bench beside her. "What's that?" "A letter," he said. "From Claire. I haven't read it. I thought maybe you could, when you're ready." Evelyn stared at it for a moment, then picked it up and tucked it under her coat. Maybe she said, maybe not. She didn't open it that night, or the next, but she kept it. For now, that was enough. The phone rang at 7:14 p.m., just as Evelyn was steeping chamomile leaves in her chipped porcelain mug. It had been days since she'd heard from anyone outside Seaforth Cove, weeks since she thought about Claire without flinching. She didn't recognize the number at first. Oregon area code, but not Nathan's, not the school board. A different one. Her fingers hovered over the receiver for a beat too long. Then she answered. Hello. There was silence, then a breath, then a voice shaky small like it had collapsed inside itself and was trying to crawl out. Mom. Evelyn blinked, sat down slowly. Claire, she said, I didn't know if you'd pick up. You were right to doubt it. The pause on the line felt ocean-wide. I'm sorry, Claire whispered. I don't know if it means anything now, but I am. I was stupid and scared, and Nathan said... Evelyn cut her off. No more blaming Nathan. Claire broke. Tears through the phone. Real ones, not weaponized emotion, not public tears. Private ones. Okay, she said through sobs. It was me. I signed it. I told him to go through with it. I thought we were doing the right thing. I thought you'd say no to everything anyway, that you didn't want the house. I didn't want the house, Evelyn said softly. I wanted to be asked. Another sob, then a whisper. Can I come see you? Evelyn closed her eyes. You can come to the library opening, she said. Saturday morning, 10 a.m. Will you talk to me? I'll talk, Evelyn said. I'm not sure I'll listen. The next day it was Nathan who showed up unannounced, uninvited, and visibly aged in a way Evelyn had never seen. He stood outside the Seaforth Library in a navy coat, too expensive for the town, a duffel bag at his feet, his eyes scanning the window like a boy outside a candy shop. Evelyn opened the door. They just stared at each other. You found it, she said. He gave a half smile. It wasn't hard. Small town. You're not lost, then? I might be, he replied, just not geographically. She let the screen door creak open. He stepped inside. They sat in the back where Evelyn kept her rocking chair and her quiet. She didn't offer tea. He didn't ask. I know I don't deserve anything, Nathan began. You don't. He nodded. Took it. I just want you to know, he continued, that I was scared. Evelyn didn't reply. He took that as permission to keep going. When Claire came to me with the plan, I thought it was logical, practical. You didn't need the house. You were alone. You always told us not to cling to things, but not people, Evelyn said. He paused. I forgot that part, or ignored it. He nodded again, then reached into his bag, pulled out an envelope. I brought this, he said. It's the check, my half of the sale. I want you to use it for the library. Evelyn didn't touch it. I already built the library. He swallowed. Then maybe you'll build something else. She looked at him, really looked. And for a moment she didn't see a liar or a thief or a disappointed son. She saw a boy again, standing in the kitchen with a loose tooth and a book report, hoping for approval. I'll let you come Saturday, she said. Nothing more. You'll sit in the back. He nodded. It was more than he deserved. That night, Evelyn stayed in the library long after the lights went out. She lit one candle, the kind Robert used to light during storms, and pulled out an old memoir, the only copy he'd ever printed, bound with thread and time. A Book Without a Shelf by Robert Grace. The first page was still water-stained from the night he read it aloud by the fireplace. She opened it. Read the first line. A house is never yours. You borrow it from memory until memory fades. Her hand lingered on the paper. Outside, the wind shifted soft coastal like someone exhaling. She whispered into the dim. Do you think they've changed, Robert? No answer. Only the flicker of the flame, and the faint rustle of pages turning themselves. The day of the dedication began with a quiet fog, a sea mist that curled around the white steps of the Seaforth Community Library like a whisper from another life. By 9 a.m., the sun was rising slow and kind, casting soft amber light across the chairs lined up in the square, the podium draped in blue velvet, and the brand-new plaque unveiled on the brick wall. The Robert Grace Literary Wing, in honor of a man who believed books build homes where hearts can return. Evelyn stood inside the library in front of a mirror she hadn't looked into since she left her old house behind. The same midnight blue dress, pressed, simple, elegant, it still fit. But she was not the same woman. Outside, people were gathering, locals in sweaters and salt-weathered jackets, children in their red with Miss Evelyn shirts, and even a few unfamiliar faces who had heard whispers of the story from nearby towns. And then came the people she never expected to return. Claire arrived first. No makeup, no audience. Just a woman with slightly shaking hands and eyes red from not sleeping. She didn't speak. She just walked up, hugged Evelyn once tightly, and stepped aside. Nathan followed slower, his hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed. He didn't attempt a speech or an excuse. He just offered a nod and said, "I'm here." And that somehow was enough. Liam approached last, his arm around Audrey, a folder tucked under the other. He kissed Evelyn gently on the cheek and whispered, "I've got something I want to say today, if that's all right." Evelyn smiled. "You'd better." By 10 o'clock, every chair was full. Evelyn stepped onto the stage. No music, no long introduction. Just her and a silence that respected her more than applause ever could. She looked at the plaque, then out at the crowd. "When I was a young woman," she began, "I thought a home was built out of walls, photos, a dining table that never moved. I thought if you kept something long enough it would protect you, that it would matter." She took a breath. "But homes can be sold, photos fade, and dining tables can be moved or worse, replaced." A hush. "But if you ever loved something truly, if you ever taught, ever gave, ever believed something small could become something lasting, then you've planted seeds." She looked directly at Claire, then Nathan. "And seeds don't care who remembers where they came from. They grow anyway." Her voice stayed steady. "This building," she gestured behind her, "is not mine. This land is not mine. Even Robert's name on that plaque, he would have hated it." Soft laughter. "But the books inside, the kids reading them, the teachers they'll become someday. That's the home. That's the family." She let that hang. A house can be stolen, but values, if you raise them right, will outlive betrayal. She stepped back from the microphone, and in the stillness people rose not to clap but to stand. Quiet, moved, grateful, not for her pain, but for her grace. Then Liam walked forward. He looked older today, not in years but in soul. "I didn't grow up poor. I didn't grow up unloved. But I did grow up confused," he began, "because I thought family meant showing up at birthdays or saying the right things at the table. But sometimes family is just one person who keeps giving even after they've been emptied." He looked at Evelyn. "And I didn't realize I had that kind of family until she nearly disappeared." Audrey reached for his hand. "I asked Grandma if I could help with the scholarship fund," he continued, "and she said yes. But what I didn't expect was that I would want to give more than money." He pulled the folder from his side and held it up. "This is the charter for the Evelyn Grace Foundation," he said. "It's a program that sends books and volunteer teachers to underfunded schools. We're starting with 3 sites this year." Gasps from the crowd. Claire's hands rose to her mouth. "She didn't ask for this," Liam said, "but she inspired it. And sometimes that's the better legacy." He stepped off the stage, and Evelyn's face broke, not in sadness, not even in pride, just release. Later that afternoon, the chairs were folded, the leftover cookies packed. People hugged, thanked, and drifted away. Nathan approached one last time. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me," he said, "but I want to learn from you, if you'll let me." Evelyn looked up at him. "I can't teach you what you already know," she replied, "but you can stay long enough to practice it." He nodded. It was more than enough. Claire, still quiet, hugged Evelyn again before walking with Nathan to their rental car. No drama, no promises, just silence. Sometimes silence was healing. That evening, Evelyn walked alone toward the shoreline. The sky was streaked in molten gold and soft fire. The tide had pulled back to reveal tiny shells scattered like punctuation marks on the sand. She didn't carry a book, or a phone, or a past, just herself. The water lapped at her feet. She stood for a moment, wind threading through her white hair, toes sinking gently into the earth. And she said not to anyone, not even to Robert, but to the waves, "I did what I could, and I let the rest walk away." Behind her, laughter from the town drifted into the air, children chasing foam, Audrey calling for Liam, and a library glowing soft against the dusk. Ahead of her, the sea was open, and this time she didn't turn back.